Professor Mokyr, in your Nobel lecture, you wanted to convey a clear message. You said, the best is yet to come. So humanity didn't reach the pinnacle of innovation yet. And the future can actually be awful, and innovation may surprise us. So this is quite a message these days, because of course our attention is most of the time on daily news that happen to be bad news. What does the broader picture, so to say, tell us?
Well, I am not totally sure that I agree with your premise that it's mostly bad news. You know, that the news media, they always tend to be biased toward the bad things and don't tell you about the good things. So it takes a historian maybe to take a few steps backward and basically say, hey, you know, things are actually going in the right direction. I'll give you two examples, but I could make more of them. The first is the good news actually was COVID. And I say this because I'm comparing COVID with the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. And I think the differences are quite striking in the sense that when the Spanish flu hit us in 1919, you know, science had no clue what it was. In fact, they didn't even discover that it was driven by a virus until the 1930s, when it was long over. We not only discovered that it was a virus within, I don't know, the first day or something, but we had the damn gene sequenced in 6 weeks, and we had a vaccine in a year. I mean, what society's ever been able to cope with a pandemic at that speed? Not the Justinian plague, not the Black Death, not cholera in 1832, not the Spanish flu. You know, we handled it so quickly. Now, it would have been nicer if we hadn't had COVID, but that's the kind of thing that happens in history all the time. New diseases pop up, and society tries to adjust. It's just that we're much better adjusting to it. The other example, which may be more controversial, is I actually have come to the conclusion that we're going to be able to cope with climate change, not through political agreements, which doesn't seem to be at all plausible, but really through technological advances, that we will be able to not only shift away from fossil fuels in a very big way, as already is happening, you know, in China already half the cars sold now are electric, and more electricity is generated by wind, solar, and so on. But also through a whole bunch of other adjustments. So one of my co-winners of the Nobel Prize this year, as a chemist, who pointed out that what they had discovered actually opened an incredible door toward the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it, you know, within what they call sort of gaps between molecules. I mean, I must say I didn't quite understand the fine chemistry of that, since the last chemistry course I had was in 1959, I think. But these look extremely serious people, and obviously so the Nobel Prize Committee thought so, and they actually said that this might well be a way in which we can withdraw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and perhaps reverse global warming and not just stop it. So that's incredibly helpful and hopeful, and that's kind of the good news. By and large, most of the bad news that you're talking about is political. It's about institutions. And I have never gone on record saying that I thought the best is just to come in terms of democracy, individual rights, freedom of the press. I'm much less, you know, I'm out of my depth there. I'm not a political scientist. But for what I see is that indeed the 21st century has not been particularly generous to us, giving us leaders like Trump and Putin, which clearly is not an improvement on what we had before, and let me leave it there. But as far as technology and science are concerned, I am convinced, okay, that the kind of things that will be discovered in the next 20 or 30 years will radically improve our lives and, maybe even more important, cope with the great challenges that the human race is facing, not only in terms of climate change, but also in other terms that are very serious. The one thing that technology cannot help us with is give us better leaders and better politicians. And I have no secret formula how to, create a machine that will get rid of, politicians of that low quality. And all one can do is hope that somehow democracy will be able to somehow, survive and fight the forces that are amassed against it. But at the moment, that's the part of my thinking that is much less optimistic.
Well, thank you very much. When it comes to that, there is quite a few people out there that tend to believe that, things like the rise of populism or Trump, this kind of stuff, they believe they are related with the emergence of new technology, the fact that large chunks of the electorate feel, displaced, that the world is changing at a pace too fast. What do you make of that?
There is some truth to that, I think. I think if you look at the long trend of history and you look at technological shocks that are happening, like the first industrial revolution, or sort of the emergence of new technologies in sort of the second industrial revolution in the late 19th century, the emergence of electricity, it's quite true that institutions had to adapt to the new technological environment. And so, for instance, to give you one example to sort of drive this home to your listeners, so when the first industrial revolution actually created something which we call the factory system, okay? I mean, that's not my term. Marx used it, 2 centuries ago, almost. And the world had to adapt to factories. So a whole bunch of regulations against child labor, against women labor, work safety regulations had to be introduced in order to sort of adjust our institutional structure to the new technological reality. The problem is, I think, that evolutionary theory suggests that adaptation can happen if the shocks are not too abrupt and too sudden and too fast. And so if the temperature changes, at 1 degree every 1,000 years, species can adjust. But if a meteorite hits us, all of a sudden, then it's much more difficult to adjust, and lots of species will go extinct, as of course they did. And so I think that kind of analogy may be applicable here, that if the technological change is too quick, institutions may not adapt, and the gap between our technological capabilities and our political structures may get bigger and bigger. And that's a source of concern. And you can sort of see some evidence of that already, sort of, if you know where to look. For instance, one thing that worries me a great deal is that the new technology that made social media possible, and essentially means that a large proportion of the world's population today lives online, get their news from online sources, get most of their social life is on sources, and entertainment and everything, it's all online. Now, there is probably nothing wrong with that, except that social media are structured in such a way as to lead to political polarization. This has been, shown 100 times over by people who research this. And, you look at political polarization, and it's basically everywhere. I mean, the two countries that I know best, Israel and the United States, clearly have become much more polarized in the last 20 years in large part, because much of the population gets their news from things like TikTok and Telegram. And that worries me. Do
your worries extend to AI? I mean, it seems to me that the main technological scare around us these days is artificial intelligence. Lots of people bet on AI making political climate wars, and of course lots of people bet on AI displacing workers and creating social turmoil and so on and so forth.
Well, I'm an AI optimist. I actually think, that we're making more of it than there actually is. The idea that somehow artificial intelligence will replace humans on this planet and all kinds of other dystopian predictions strike me as sort of science fiction. I mean, we've had changes like that before, and people make similar predictions. You know, when the personal computer was introduced, you know, there were all kinds of stories about how computers would replace us, and there would be massive technological unemployment. To my way of thinking, the real problem that the human race is going to be facing more and more in the next decades or century is a shortage of manpower. There will be more and more people not working, in large part because they're old and they're retired, but also because, you know, there's too many fun things to do in the world, and people don't really want to work. They want to just stay home and watch football, or, you know, go play video games or whatever. And so there'll be great manpower shortage, and the combination of AI and robotics is going to replace jobs that people don't want to do. And I must say, I don't see exactly the negative side of it. I mean, the truth is, the world is going to need an incredible number of people who will change the diapers on old guys like me when we're no longer capable of doing that, okay? It's not that people are standing in line to take these jobs. And so eventually we will have to find a way to mechanize this. I don't see why that's a concern. That's a hope I have. The other thing that artificial intelligence will do, probably better than anything else, is help us to do research. It doesn't do the research for us, but it's a fantastic research assistant. I mean, I can't say how many times in the last 6 months or year I have been writing a paper and I sort of trying to do, Jesus, when was the Edict of Nantes revoked? Well, that's something I should know by heart, but I'm just making this up as an example. I hit ChatGPT and I say, when was the Edict of Nantes revoked? And I get an answer, okay? That's a fantastic research assistant. I don't have to get to the library and pull out an encyclopedia and look up the Edict of Nantes. It saves time, basically. It makes my research more efficient. What's true for me is true on a much larger scale for people working in material science, people working in pharmaceutics, people working in energy, people working in molecular biology, you name it, okay? It's a fantastic research assistant. And so the amount of scientific research and the quality of scientific research is going to expand enormously thanks to AI. And that, of course, is going to feed back into better technology. So if we're ever going to crack the great challenge that technology has faced since World War II, it's, of course, nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion, if we can get that to work, you know, a lot of things will change. But here we worked on it now for more than half a century, and it's always, you know, as people said, it's 10 years away and always will be. But I think with AI, we have a chance of actually doing what we know is physically possible, but it's just beyond us. But think about it, once we have nuclear fusion, we have essentially a fixed supply and an endless supply of energy at very low cost and almost no environmental impact. That is going to change the way the world is in many ways, and I think they're all going to be good. The one thing that worries me about AI, if I may say so, it's not AI, it's the people using it. And that's the scary part. But, you know, that has always been the problem with technology. It was a problem with the first, you know, paleo.
It was the problem with fire.
Early people invented the axe, okay? So here's an axe. You can use it to build a home, or you can use it to kill your neighbor. The same is true for nuclear power. I mean, you can make it to create clean energy, and you can use it to throw a bomb. In that regard, AI isn't any different than anything else. But, as I said, I see institutions and the people running the world becoming of lower and lower quality, and it's totally possible that AI will be used and abused and misused by authoritarian regimes to suppress their own people. We see this happening nowadays in Iran. We see it happening in many other countries. And that's, of course, a concern. But that concern is not new. It's always been with us. It will always be with us. You want technology, you give people more power, you're going to make sure that the people using it use it well and not just using it badly. And there is no way I can predict to what extent one will dominate or the other.
You mentioned COVID before. I do remember that during COVID, you've written a few rather optimistic, so to say, articles stressing that, a reason for optimism during the pandemic was the fact that our growth was based upon innovation more than on trade. So somehow the problems it faced were more easy to overcome, more easy between commas, of course. One thing that surprised me is that trade, nonetheless, has been tremendously resilient. It's been very resilient during the pandemic. It's very resilient these days in spite of protectionism. Is that in part due to the fact that our economic growth is Schumpeterian? That we have so much innovation, which is also helping trade?
Oh, I think that's certainly true, and that transportation costs have been declining steadily for the last 50 years. And one of the great inventions of the post-war period was the container ship, which had brought down transportation. But don't underestimate the capabilities of bad leaders to screw this up, okay? I mean, we are now living in a country in which the leader has said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. So far, trade, as you said, has been resilient, but there have been periods in which that was not the case. In August 1914, if I may remind you, I mean, you're not old enough to remember that, neither am I, but we both know the story. In August 1914, international trade essentially ground to a halt and didn't really recover until after, say, 1950. And so for a long time, trade declined. More recently, if I may remind you, and this you will remember, I certainly do, is that after 9/11,
yes,
international trade ground to a halt for a couple of months. Ships weren't sailing, planes weren't flying, lots of things were short, the shortage of lots of things in stores because there was no trade. And, we were lucky that after a while it dawned on people that 9/11 and the attack on the World Trade Center was a one-off. But had there been 2 or 3 other similar attacks, there's no way of knowing what would have happened to trade. So yes, trade is resilient to some extent, but if you shock it enough, I think it could ground to a halt. And this has happened repeatedly in history over time, including, if you'd like, what happened to in the closing centuries of the Roman Empire. Remember, the Roman Empire was essentially built on the gains from trade around the Mare Nostrum, right? I mean, there wasn't all that much technological change, but trade was big. The Romans provided security, they enforced contracts, and there were ships. But by 500 or 600 AD, that ground to a halt for a variety of reasons, and we went into an age of poverty and barbarism that lasted 300 or 400 years. So, I mean, I hope you're right in that trade is going to be resilient, to economic ignoramuses like Trump. But this is not guaranteed, and I do worry about that. But what you said is correct. That is to say, there's been so much innovation that even if the gains from trade are cut, we will be able to keep up our current high level of living standards up, because technology and knowledge are much more resilient than trade. You can't kill all the people who know a particular technique. Everything is almost everything is written down anyway. It's in journals, it's in books, it's in models, it's in online. I mean, it would be extremely hard to this day and age to undo technological change, unlike in the past, in which such things did take place from time to time.
One big difference between the American economy and the European one is technology and productivity. European productivity has been stagnating for quite a while. Now, one of the great themes of your books, of your research, is the intersection, the way in which culture allowed for innovation to spring. Is there a problem with the European culture now? How can Europe get back, to more sustained rates of innovation? For some people in today's political debate, the big answer is increased military spending, trusting the spin-off of military spending. Is that a sensible view?
No. I have never believed for a moment in my life that investing in military knowledge has significant spillover effects to the civilian economy, to the point where, this is something that I would recommend. Now, such spillovers have occurred, of course, and nobody would deny them, but they've been very expensive because, for every spillover, you also spend a huge amount of resources building machines and tools that just kill people, which do not seem to contribute to human welfare by my definitions as an economist, okay? Now, as a side effect of that, you build a lot of bombers, okay? You might eventually improve the structure of civilian airplanes, say. But think of all the bombs that have been dropped on cities. Those are expensive. That's an expensive improvement. The same is true for, say, the chemical industry in World War I, where chemical warfare was developed. I mean, you learn something about chemistry, but man, compared to the suffering of people who got poisoned by the gases that the combatants poured on each other, it's very small. So no, if Europeans want to develop their economies, they should spend more money on doing R&D in productive uses, okay? And I really wish it wasn't the case that they had to rearm and raise the proportion spent on defense from 2%, which is what NATO used to require, to the levels that we see today in some countries, which is going up to 5% in places like Estonia and Finland and places that border on Russia. So I don't want to see that. I think here's what I really believe. Part of the huge success of Europe in its growth after 1945 is essentially a peace dividend. The European nations were basking under the American nuclear umbrella, and as a result, they basically stopped spending on the military and spent it on other things, which led to accelerated economic growth that started in late 1940s and lasted until about 1970 or something like that. And that was an amazing achievement. And they basically thought, that they didn't have to have conscription armies, they didn't have to spend any money on the military because the US would cover from them. Well, I don't think there's many Europeans who still trust the United States to protect them, and so they're going to have to spend more. That will have a cost. I think these costs will exceed the benefits by a large order of magnitude. But it may be inevitable, given the aggressiveness of some of their neighbors. But I don't look forward to that, and I don't think that's the answer to European stagnation. My interpretation of European stagnation, there's sort of 2 or 3 alternative hypotheses. One of them, which was proposed by the late Ed Prescott, who passed away last year, but a Nobel Prize winner and a famous macroeconomist. And Ed basically argued that the main reason why Europe was stagnating and the United States was doing so much better was taxes. Europeans were, taxed heavier than the Americans, particularly very high marginal taxes, And so that sort of distorted the allocation of resources and killed all the incentives. And somebody in the audience got up. I remember when Ed gave this talk at Northwestern, and one of my colleagues got up and said, well, Ed, did you know that in the 1950s, the marginal tax in the United States on income was 90%? And it remained that high until the Reagan tax reform of 1984. And so taxes, I don't think, make for all that much of a difference. But there's something that I think is deeper than that. And that is that there is, I think, part of the reason why Europe's economic growth is so slow is that we're mismeasuring it. Because people don't include leisure in total output. And that the fact of the matter is that Europeans have a very high preference for leisure, much more so than the Americans, or maybe the preferences are the same, but the supply side is different. That I don't know. But the fact is that the number of hours worked per year in Europe, if you count it correctly, you take into account, retirement age and age of joining the labor force and, sick leave and vacations and so on, is considerably shorter than in the United States. And in other words, Europeans aren't consuming it in goods, they're consuming it in leisure, and you need leisure to enjoy the goods that you're producing, because leisure and consumption are complements, right? If you buy a pair of skis, you need time to go to the slopes and ski, right? I mean, it's that simple. And so I must say the last thing in the world I worry about is living standards in Europe. In fact, I tell my students this. I say one of the striking things about Europe today, that in large parts of it, not everywhere, but in large parts, essentially poverty has disappeared. I can walk the streets of Dublin or Amsterdam or Zurich or Hamburg or Copenhagen or Stockholm, and I don't see poor people. You see people that are richer than others, of course, that's true in every society. But actual poverty, the way, development economy would define it, people who really don't know where their next meal is coming from and who can't afford a coat that has no hope. I mean, that's basically gone. The country which it still exists is the United States, because we're mismanaged. But in Europe, in most countries, if you walk around the streets of Antwerp, you tell me how many real poor people you see. The only poor people you see is people who came from other parts of the world, which are poor and are still trying to sort of find their footing. But of the local people, the native people, poverty essentially disappeared. So the New Testament says somewhere, the poor will always be with you. Well, Jesus hasn't been in Zurich lately.
Well, I know we are running out of time, but I need to ask you a last question. I mean, you just published with Avner Grief and Guido Tabellini a very important book, a challenging comparison between the European and Chinese institution, and that it's a great attempt to explain why Europe had an earlier industrial takeoff and is making lots of different factors, including political centralization, part of your story. But my question is about the Chinese economy. I mean, a few years ago, lots of people thought, for example, another Nobel laureate, Ronald Coase, he wrote a book on China, and he witnessed, very fast economic growth in that country. But he thought, innovation was out of question. China was deemed to be a Me Too economy for the time being because the market of idea was too controlled by government. Instead, in the last few years, we've seen tremendous innovation coming out of China. Why is that? Were you surprised? Should people be worried about China as they are?
Oh, worried? Why should I be worried if the Chinese invent things that will make my life better? Then I don't see it all. Should we be worried about the Chinese competing with us? With the West? Yes. If you are competing with the Chinese, who are efficient and hardworking and industrious, and you are a European who is sort of between his previous vacation and his next vacation, then then maybe you ought to worry. But look, if you knew some Chinese history, you would, of course, realize immediately that the Chinese are incredibly creative and innovative, and that lots of the stuff that we use in the West was invented in China. And that until about 1200 or 1300, they were by far the most innovative country, not only inventing, gunpowder and the compass, which everybody knows about, but also innovating in things that became the mainstay of the Industrial Revolution in Europe: cotton textiles, the use of coal, the iron industry. The Chinese had it all, and they were making huge progress. And then at some point, and that's what much of the book is about, something went wrong. And China stopped innovating, and they stagnated, and eventually the Europeans surpassed them. Okay, that's the story. But they have it in them. It's not like Confucian culture or Chinese culture or whatever you're thinking is driving this, are incapable of innovating. And so Ronald Coase, who was a great economist and a man whom I admired a great deal, but I think he should have probably learned something if he had picked up one of those Joseph Needham books on science and civilization in China and realized how creative the Chinese had been. And their society was not free the way Europeans became free during and after the Enlightenment. There certainly was a rather, shall we say, authoritarian regime of a Chinese emperor and his bureaucracy. But the Chinese government basically supported innovation and rewarded mandarins who actually came up with things. Okay, and the book is full of examples of people who did that. And so the notion that the Chinese can't innovate, they can only imitate, it's a very Eurocentric kind of notion that's based on the ignorance of history. They can innovate, they are innovating, they will innovate more. And, my attitude to that is the more the better, because, innovations don't stay in China. They spill over to the West, just as Western innovations, in the past had been adopted by China. And this sort of flow of innovation and new ideas from the technological leader to other nations is a source of prosperity for everybody. And so if the Chinese come up with a way of doing nuclear fusion or getting artificial intelligence better or coming up with a different vaccine for the flu or something, why should you complain? This is something that's going to make everybody better. At the end, what really matters is the sort of flow of services and goods that reach the consumers. That's what Adam Smith told us, and that's a truth that we should never forget. It's not jobs that count, it's consumption. And so the Chinese have given us, for the last 20 years, if you look at the United States and you look at what people buy and what they consume, Chinese ingenuity has given us a great deal of cheap consumer goods that people at the lower ends of the income distributions can benefit. And so they buy cheap Chinese clothing, they buy cheap Chinese toys, they buy cheap Chinese televisions. What could be wrong with that? That's my attitude, and I don't worry about China becoming innovative. What I worry about a little bit is the sort of international relations aspect of this and the sort of hostility that may emerge between the West and China, not so much because there are really big differences between the two of them, but because they're opportunistic politicians who are basically inciting their people against the other. And, you think about, for instance, what happened during COVID and how Trump went around and was referring to it as, as the China virus, and essentially there were attacks on Chinese Americans and some people who just looked like Chinese Americans but were really Japanese or Korean, attacks on them because they had brought the COVID virus to the United States. I mean, it's that kind of stuff that worries me, but not what the Chinese are actually doing for us. The more they innovate, the better. In the Middle Ages, they gave us paper and they gave us a compass, and they gave us better ship design, and they gave us cotton. All this was great. If they now come up with new innovations that the West can benefit from, I say ahlan and sahlan, as they say in Arabic.
This was very refreshing. Thank you so much, Professor Mokyr.
Thank you, and all the best, and stay well, old friend.